That's why I named the book The Fearless Organization rather than the Psychologically Safe Organization. Psychological safety is a term that's been in the academic literature for a long time. And then my research, starting about 25 years ago, started to really move the construct into the mainstream of academic research. It's a variable that explains a lot of outcomes, learning outcomes, performance outcomes. But I think when you take it out of that academic context, it sounds soft and it sounds nice. And it isn't about being nice, right? It's about being candid. And candor can hurt.
Hi, I'm James Taylor, business creativity and innovation keynote speaker, and this is The Creative Life, a show dedicated to you, the creative. If you're looking for motivation, inspiration, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's an author, musician, entrepreneur, performer, designer, or thought leader. They'll share with you their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, and much, much more. You'll find show notes for this episode, as well as free training on creativity, over at jamestaylor.me. Enjoy this episode. Hey there, it's James Taylor, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Amy C. Edmondson. Amy is the Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at Harvard Business School. She has written numerous articles for Harvard Business Review and 4 books, including Teaming, which showed how leaders can make organizational learning happen. Her awards include the 2018 Sumantra Ghoshal Award for Rigor and Relevance in the Study of Management and the 2017 Thinkers50 Talent Award. She received her PhD in Organizational Behavior, her Master's in Psychology, and her Bachelor's in Engineering and Design from Harvard University. Her latest book is called The Fearless Organization, Creating Psychological Safety in the Workplace for Learning, Innovation, and Growth. And it's my great pleasure to have Amy on the show today. So welcome, Amy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So share with everyone what's happening in your world just now.
Well, what's happening is I have a book coming out in 2 weeks, as you just said, The Fearless Organization. I'm absolutely busy teaching in companies and in the school here to talk about the subject of that book, in fact.
So we're hearing all these stories all the time about, like, for example, Volkswagen, Wells Fargo, times when organizations have made missteps very much when it comes to creating a sense of a culture of fear, and that's caused large problems for those organizations. What was there anything in particular, any particular story that made you want to write this book at this time in history? It
was several of these stories happening at once. I mean, that I kept seeing an echo in the headlines. You know, the Wells Fargo story, the VW story first, the Wells Fargo story, and then even the Me Too stories that were coming out all seemed to me to share an underlying structure where people are in organizations, in the workplace, and afraid to speak up, afraid to say what's really going on, afraid to ask for help, afraid to report bad news. And that can at times create the illusion of success, as at Wells Fargo and VW, and then eventually come to light and be a much bigger failure than it had to be.
So the book revolves around this idea of psychological safety. So if anyone that hasn't really heard that phrase before, what does psychological safety actually mean?
Psychological safety is a belief that I can speak up with work-relevant ideas, questions, concerns, and even mistakes, right? That it's an idea that all work-relevant content is welcome here, even that which we would normally think of as somewhat interpersonally risky. And when I say interpersonally risky, I mean something that might not make me look good. Look, I made a mistake. I fell short. I'm not sure what to do. I have a question. You know, we're hardwired and socialized to believe that we need to look good, especially in the eyes of higher ups at all times, and especially in the workplace. And that really gets in the way of excellence in knowledge-intensive work. We've got to be willing to take risks. We've got to be willing to ask for help or offer a crazy idea that may or may not go anywhere.
So one of those kind of offering kind of crazy ideas is, I was having a conversation with someone the other day, and we were talking about questions and why, you know, early on in, say, child development, questions are a big thing. You know, why? And then we kind of go to college or school, university, and those questions are slowly kind of knocked out of us, where as further you get up the organization, you're expected to have all the answers, not be asking any questions. Right. So you work with very senior leaders. How can you ensure that they can create a sense for other people in the organization to not be fearful of asking those questions, those difficult questions?
You're absolutely right. When we're young, we spontaneously ask questions. We're born curious. We exercise that curiosity. And then as time goes on, we begin to make the mistake, I think, of thinking that answers are the real currency. And of course, the higher you go, the more you can make that mistake. But now you've got to stop to consider, and this is, I think, what great leaders do, stop to consider that the world is a fast-changing place and changing faster than ever. So it would make no sense to imagine I should have all the answers, not only today, but for tomorrow. By definition, I don't know what's going to happen next. We're all subject to enormous uncertainty and volatility and complexity. So if I am not forcing myself to be and exercise my curiosity, I'm going to get left behind, right? So the wise people, the wise leaders are not only asking good questions themselves, but they're reminding others that questions are welcome and valuable and kind of a sign of intelligence, not a sign of ignorance.
And one of the companies you mentioned in the book is Pixar. I think it was Ed Catmull said something recently. He said instead of companies having mission statements, they should have mission questions. Instead, there's constantly kind of revising. Because mission statement feels like it's kind of a destination. Well, mission questions is a constantly evolving thing, and it can last for many decades. So when you looked at Pixar as an example, what do they do differently in order to create that sense of that there's people can take risks, and there is dealing with that kind of psychological safety?
Well, I particularly looked into a routine or a process they have at Pixar called the Braintrust. And the Braintrust is like a special space. It's a special convening opportunity that happens periodically through the development of a new movie. And it's created as a space with particular rules and guidelines and norms where you are required to offer criticism and observations and everything that you sort of notice and think and feel while you're watching the movie. And part of the process makes sure that people see it as, the critique is of the movie, not of the person or the people who wrote the script or who drew created the figures and so on. So it's very disciplined to say we're focusing on the product, and everybody kind of shares the same assumption that the only way you get to great is by looking at, almost great or good enough and figuring out how it could be even better. So it's a kind of a shared assumption. So I'm not going to make the claim that everybody at Pixar feels psychologically safe 24/7, all the time, but they go to particular care to create the Braintrust as a place where this strange behavior is absolutely welcome and expected.
We're not talking about kind of just a soft, touchy-feely type of feedback. This is quite a very rigorous. I know. I've heard that people, friends of mine that worked at Pixar, they said basically you have to go away for the rest of the day because you're so exhausted by getting all this feedback from all these great minds, and you have to. And it reminds me, there's a very kind of apt Scottish phrase they used to use during the Enlightenment period in Scotland, and people like David Hume and Adam Smith, and it was called flighting, and which is I believe it basically stands for, it's a word which means the kind of the ritual abuse of your opponent by use of verbal violence. So that's a very extreme version. Right. But even though these people were competitors there, they were actually, there was a huge levels of trust and intimacy, and there was a kindness because and so violence can sound quite hard, but when you're talking about creating that sense of psychological safety, how can you do that at the same time as creating the ideas are really going to be challenged and people don't just try and put kid gloves on and hold back?
You bet. So important. And in fact, that's why I named the book The Fearless Organization rather than the Psychologically Safe Organization. Psychological safety is a term that's been in the academic literature for a long time. And then my research, starting about 25 years ago, started to really move the construct into the mainstream of academic research. It's a variable that explains a lot of outcomes, learning outcomes, performance outcomes. So, but I think when you take it out of that academic context, it sounds soft and it sounds nice, and it isn't about being nice, right? It's about being candid, and candor can hurt. So I like to say, we're all vulnerable to being hurt. Nobody wants to be criticized. Nobody wants something they've just done to be less than perfect. But we have to accept, that's part of wisdom. You accept that, in fact, something I just did isn't perfect. And you sort of say, all right, I'm not going to really love this, but I am absolutely willing to hear it. Why? Because what I really want is to make it better, right? What I really want is for this movie to be great, or this class to be great, or this book to be great. And so it's kind of that willingness and that wisdom to take the short-term blow for the longer term win. So, okay, I'll go through this process and I'll get the criticism, and it won't be entirely fun, but I'd so much rather that now with my colleagues than by the critics in the newspaper or the media, X months from now when it comes out and people say it's sappy or uninteresting, right? So it's the wisdom to know that you're better off taking the hit now than later.
Do you think actually, even though this book is definitely written for organizations, for leaders and teams, do you think there's actually something that academia can also take from this? Because I was having a conversation at the weekend there with someone who's just done their PhD at Oxford, and they were describing the very rigorous process that happens when, and I've forgotten the name of what it's actually called at Oxford, where you prepare your thing and you go in and you have to go in front of this room of leading scholars on your particular topic, and you are grilled. You're really, it's a very, very rigorous type of thing.
Right.
But the hope is that it produces something which is better, and the ideas can be tested. So with what you learned working with organizations, do you think it's possible to take some of those ideas and move them actually into academia, and it can actually help in the world of academia?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that he's probably describing a thesis defense, a dissertation defense, right? And again, I think of that as an opportunity to reframe the criticism, which can, especially, in some fields more than others, feel like incredibly intense criticism. It can feel almost mean. But the reality is, in academia, if your work isn't very good, we're not really going to take the time to get deep and criticize it intensely, right? So it's a mark of respect. It's like, this piece of research is good enough that we're willing to take all the time and energy it takes to read it carefully, find the flaws. I respect you enough to believe that A, your work is worth it, and B, you're probably capable of addressing and responding to those flaws. So it's a reframe from, oh, they're attacking me and that's not nice, to, oh, they respect me enough to want to make it better, and they respect me enough to ask these really hard questions. I guarantee it, I don't, as a full professor at Harvard, I don't ask people really hard questions if I don't think they're, up to it, because I don't really want to embarrass someone.
You had the opportunity of kind of early in your career being the chief engineer with the inventor Buckminster Fuller. I'm interested to know, like, in terms of someone like that, what
like Bucky,
yeah. So how is that different from that? Obviously, this long period of time has gone between someone like him and some of the newer. Really, the future leaders that you're helping to school and to train at places like Harvard. What are you noticing about those differences? What other things that maybe the new generation can learn from Buckminster Fuller? And maybe what were the things that you perhaps wished in terms of feedback that you had when you were working with someone like him?
That's a wonderful sort of line of questioning. So Bucky was the ultimate the ultimate kid in a way. Even in his late 80s, he was perpetually curious. He was always asking questions. He was always interested in, the new things that people were seeing. I remember one time where he couldn't believe my running shoes, right? They were so light and so he just, when he was growing up, he'd run in leather shoes of some kind, right? I mean, he couldn't believe the advances in technology. He marveled over it. So he had this great sense of curiosity, this great sense of appreciation, and he would always say things that, he was tough, he had high standards, but he would always say things that led me to believe I was absolutely respected and trusted with some of his, important design work. So it was enormously enabling, right? It was, he empowered me. He'd say, okay, I think you could go, figure out how to create that 2-frequency deresonated structure. And I'd be thinking, really? I don't know if I can do that, but of course I'd go off and struggle and keep trying and then figure out the math. And that was an incredibly, exciting and, feeling of pride to solve the tough problem. I watch my kids do that now in high school and college. You get a really tough problem set and they think, I can't do it, but then they just don't get up until they figure it out. And that's a great feeling.
So someone like him that had that curious mind, obviously that's as the individual. If I'm a leader of an organization with thousands of employees all over the world, how do I almost like kind of institutionalize that curiosity? Is there a big framework that you share in the book that can help that leader to kind of take that and really permeate it throughout an organization?
So I think that one of the leader's most important jobs is to kind of paint reality for us, frame the situation we're in a way that absolutely captures your attention and energy. So, for example, Bucky, his frame was always, I think we can use our big minds to create a better world. How do we do that? We do that by designing new functional things that don't exist, like geodesic dome, for example. But but that's sort of more of an individual level invention. But for him, he was an individual level inventor. But if you're leading an organization like an Apple or a Pixar, what you're doing is trying to create the conditions where you're harnessing others' efforts, ingenuity, creativity, and intelligence to create something new that can't be done by individuals. It can only be done by individuals teaming up to make this happen. So you're trying. So how do you cultivate both the curiosity and the commitment to kind of drive forward and get it done? I think the curiosity part starts with reminding people, like routinely reminding people of uncertainty, of possibility, right? That our tacit state as a human being is to think we know it all, to think we see reality and we've got a good grasp on reality, when in fact all we see is our perception of reality. Yeah. Right? And so we got to be reminded all the time that it's up to us and we have the ability to make it better. Like if we really put our minds to it, we can make it better. And so I think when leaders are expressing a kind of sense of possibility, aspiration, it's just outside of reach. You're going to put a man on the moon within the decade. We're going to have 100% patient safety. We're going to come up with the best new device, whatever. It's exciting and it's a place that you can only get to through curiosity and a certain degree of humility. Like, we don't know how to do this yet, but we're going to figure it out.
What is the role of the environment that people are working in, the actual physical space? I mean, there's that expression where they say, if you have a sick fish, you want to change the water, not the fish. So can the actual physical environment, I mean, you mentioned Buckminster Fuller there, and I think like the Epcot Dome and things. Can the environment actually help to reduce that psychological fear, to increase that sense of psychological safety?
It's a great question. I think there are two aspects of the environment, the work environment, that matter. One is just, you mentioned Epcot. I mean, there are some spaces that you walk into and you instantly feel just a little bit inspired. Like they're asking for a larger vision, right? That maybe the ceilings are high, maybe the light is natural, and it just feels right. And there's and then conversely, there's some spaces you walk into that feel cramped, pressing, or just like, I'm not going to be able to do good work here. I remember back in college, think, I really love to work in this library, not that library, back when we worked in libraries, right? Because the space was either energizing or not.
Yeah.
But I think the more important aspect of the work environment today is it set up for happy collisions? Do I go off into my office, close the door, and never see anybody, or is it sort of am I forced to walk by others, to intersect, whether it's at the coffee machine or in the hallways or on the stairwells? Are the stairwells sort of in the center of the building and wide and inviting so that we use them rather than the elevator? And when we do that, do we bump into each other? And when we bump into each other, do we stop and chat? And do we find kind of from these happy collisions, do we find new opportunities to innovate?
Because you mentioned silence a number of times in the book. You talk about this kind of recurring thing of silence and actually
yes.
the dangers perhaps of silence. You go around some organizations that's like really quiet. There's not much kind of going on here. So what did you find when in your research when you were doing in terms of the link between silence and fearless organizations?
It's not always, but silence is often a marker of fear. Right. So if someone is silent, we don't know if they're silent because they have nothing to say or if they're silent because they're reluctant to say it. And so, of course, we always want to err on the side of assuming they have something to say, and we got to figure out a way to make it safer for them to say it. And to a certain extent, that can be done simply by asking good questions. But I'll come back to that. But I think that we often fail to make that connection between silence and fear. Like if someone's silent, we don't notice it. It's not really a very observable fact, right? And so the silence is there. It might mean, a person sees a harm that they are just too unsure of to speak up about, or it might mean, again, they're just not seeing anything.
When you look at these, like, say, science fiction type movies, and they're futuristic, and the thing always strikes me is how silent they are. And I thought that's not nothing like any work environment I've ever been in. What about you? I think about those kind of organizations which have this sense of trust, there is a sense of safety. It's rigorous, but it's a sense of safety, and humor is used very extensively. And I have to be careful here because obviously I have a British sense of humor, and having worked in California as well, I noticed I had to tweak it slightly because some types of humor don't necessarily translate all the time. Did you find any link between humor and places being open to humor, and also that sense of being safe places in which to express your ideas and to explore ideas?
There is a link, and there's actually two kinds of humor. And there's the kind of humor that I guess you could fundamentally, and often this is British, but you could fundamentally characterize it as self-deprecating. That's very powerful. That's very freeing, right? When managers use self-deprecating humor, it lightens the space, it lightens the topic, it makes it, we laugh, we feel more relaxed, we feel invited. But the other kind of humor is sort of other deprecating humor. And the kind of humor that either on purpose or by mistake makes fun of others, puts others down, even in jest, even in a nice, even though we all might realize, oh, this is just good fun, there's a part of the brain that's just registering it as cruel, and it shrinks away, right? That when a joke is at someone's expense, it actually does quite the opposite, right? So humor isn't a simple function.
So as you've gone on your own kind of journey, your own kind of creative and innovative journey, was there a key aha moment or light bulb moment in your life where you said, this is the direction I want to go with my work. This is how I can make the world a better place?
Oh, that's a wonder. So I think, I had the aha moment. So I worked for Buckminster Fuller, and he was all about making the world a better place, but through design and through engineering. And I began to realize I wasn't really an engineer. I'd studied engineering in college, but it wasn't sort of in my nature. I ultimately began to realize I was much more interested in people, and people in the workplace, and people in organizations. So the aha moment came when I took a job before graduate school. I took a job in a consulting company where we worked with big organizations on on change programs and on, building self-managed teams and all that kind of stuff. And the aha moment was, this is actually about making the world a better place. But I don't have to design a new housing system to make the world a better place. I can find ways to make the workplace better, which is where, after all, most people spend most of their waking hours. If I can find ways to make the workplaces more humane, more inspiring, and ultimately more able to cultivate and put the talent that they have to good use, that really is an opportunity to make a difference. And one that speaks to me and speaks more to my sort of particular interests and skills.
So as we start to finish up here, I've got some kind of final quick fire questions. In the work that you do, are there any tools or apps, for example, that you find very, very useful in your work?
Oh gosh, I should tell you the tools and apps that I want to exist that don't, right? So I think we need a tool or an app that helps us ask really good questions real time when we need to, right? So what's a good question? A good question is one that A, you don't know the answer for, and B, it's not so like, what are you thinking? That's not a good question. A good question, actually, you've been asking good questions. A good question focuses the target on something of importance, right? It gives them room to respond, right? So it's not
catalytic
enough.
The catalytic.
Yes, it's catalytic. It helps, right? It's enabling. It helps people think and focus and gives them just the right amount of space they need to fully respond and contribute, to the conversation, to the dialogue. So I think if we could have because sometimes you want to ask a good question and then all of a sudden you find yourself asking a yes/no question or a leading question or an unhelpful question, right? So that would be a great tool to have.
That sounds like a very useful AI assistant that we should have sitting there all the time. I think Picasso said, computers are stupid, they only give you answers. And actually, we want questions. So, if anyone's listening, watching this just now, and you would like to create a very powerful app, then maybe the AI assistant could help there. What about a book? If there was one book that you were to recommend, not one of your own books, but a book by another author that you think is impacted you in a very deep way, or you think just more people should be reading, what is that book?
I would say one that impacted me, and I think more people should be reading, is Leadership and Self-Deception by the Arbinger Institute, which is it's not a magnificent book in the sense of something beautifully written or inspiring, but it's a deceptive little book. It's a novel about a couple of people, few people, and in reading this sort of, not very literary novel, you get very deep insights into human cognition and human emotion and the ways in which we tie ourselves up in knots. And I think it's hard to see the social world the same after you read that book.
Now, you're based in the kind of Boston area. I know you obviously have Harvard, great business school there as well. You also have another great school, Berklee School of Music. So I have to ask you, if there's one album, one record that you love more than any other, what would that be?
I think it would be Althea by the Grateful Dead, which was a 1980 album, and just some beautiful lyrical songs, including the title song, Althea.
Fantastic. And we're going to have all these links here. People go to jamestaylor.me and just type in Amy C. Edmondson. You're going to get all the links here as well. A final question for you. I want you to imagine you woke up tomorrow morning and you have to start from scratch. You've got all the skills, all the knowledge you've acquired over the years, but no one knows you. You know no one. You have to restart. What would you do? How would you restart?
Gosh, I guess I'd have to sign up. I'd have to find a way to make myself useful. So I'd have to look around for problems to solve. I'd have to find people because I'd still have my skills, right? Yes. I'd still have my I just wouldn't have any network or anything else. So I'd have to say, what is it that I do well, which is kind of listening and thinking and helping people find a different path to reach the goals they want to reach. And then I'd look very hard for people who have some problems like that I might be able to help them solve.
So finally, if people want to learn more about the book and also to maybe reach in, to connect with you as well, where's the best place for them to go and do that?
Well, go to hbs.edu and then enter Amy Edmondson. You'll get to my faculty page and learn more about the articles that are out there in the books and the courses and various things.
Well, Amy, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing all about your creative life. The book, The Fearless Organization, is out now. People can get their copies today, and I wish you all the best with your future work.
Thank you so much, James. It's wonderful talking with you.
If you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.